Hello, my name is Brian Daniels, and I am an assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts, Boston in the school psychology program. And I'm very excited to present this module to you today entitled Using Social Emotional and Behavioral Screening Data. This is a particular area of interest for me in my research, and it's also a topic I find very interesting given my prior experiences as a practitioner and as a consultant for school districts in Massachusetts. One of the things that I noticed is that school districts often find it easy to identify a screening tool that they would like to use and carry out the screening or conduct the screening, but they require much more guidance and support around actually using the data to make decisions. So the purpose of this module is to provide you with some guidance around actually using your screening data to make decisions. A couple of notes as we move forward. From this point forward, I will be referring to social, emotional, and behavioral screening data as simply SEB data or SEB Screening. I'd also like to recognize my co-presenters, Dr. Stacy Bender from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and soon to be Dr. Whitney Walker from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, both in the school psychology program. I'd also like to recognize the project leadership, Melissa Perot from UMass Boston and Sarah Whitcomb from UMass Amherst. So let's get started. The mission of the Birch Project is to provide professional development and resources for schools in order to strengthen the coordination of behavioral health supports provided by the school and community agencies. The Birch Project is housed at the University of Massachusetts, Boston and the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and it draws on ongoing partnerships with the Boston Children's Hospital Neighborhood Partnership Program, as well as many local school districts, including the Boston Public Schools and their comprehensive behavioral health model, which you may have heard about in various presentations. More information about the Birch Project can be found at www.umb.edu/birch. Given that this presentation or this module is focused on using social, emotional, and behavioral screening data, we are going to assume that there are a few things that have already been done. First, this module assumes that you or your school district has already selected a SEB screening tool to use. We also assume that you have a school-wide team responsible for analyzing the SEB data already in place. So you have some school team that meets regularly to review student data, including screening data. And we assume that the school-wide team has the power to make decisions regarding changes to universal instruction or targeted and intensive intervention. So in some school districts, one team may be responsible for making decisions related to social, emotional functioning and behavior across all levels. In other systems, there may be one team responsible for universal instruction or intervention, one team responsible for targeted intervention, and one team responsible for individualized intervention. And there are some differences with each one of these levels, which make it sometimes more efficient and practical to have separate teams. There are many reasons that a school district might want to conduct social emotional screening, SEB screening. The first is population monitoring, in which data are used to examine the overall level of risk for a student body within a school or grade level. Monitoring the risk of population is particularly useful for evaluating and informing changes to Tier 1 or universal social, emotional, and behavioral supports. Second reason is identification, in which school-based teams use screening data to determine which students are not responding to the universal supports. And once these students are identified, they are connected to appropriate targeted Tier 2 or intensive Tier 3 social, emotional, and behavioral interventions. In a multi-tiered system of support, students are provided with intervention that varies in intensity based on the level of their needs. So it's important to understand that SEB screening data may be used differently at different levels to make decisions regarding intervention. At the universal or Tier 1 level, SEB screening data may be used to evaluate and inform changes to core SEL instruction or the way in which school-wide positive behavior expectations are taught and reinforced. So it's important to remember that in a multi-tiered system of support, all students are provided with universal SEB supports, even those students who need targeted or intensive intervention. So everyone gets the universal supports as a starting point. At the targeted or tier 2 level, screening data are used to identify students who have not responded to universal supports. And SEB screening data may be used to match those students with the most appropriate available interventions or supports. And I will explain this in more detail in the following sections. At the intensive or tier 3 level, screening data are used to identify students who are at significant risk and require individualized intensive intervention. So screening data may be used to identify general areas in which to focus the intervention. However, at the intensive level, additional data such as the results of a functional behavior assessment or a psychoeducational evaluation are often needed to identify individual factors that may be contributing to maladaptive behavior for a particular student. So SEB screening at the intensive level gives us a starting point, but it's not all the information that we need. The first step in analyzing SEB screening data is to determine at what level the problems exist, and more importantly, at what level to focus intervention. So in other words, the question is it a large group problem, a small group problem, or an individual student problem? And recommendations in this slide come from the Guiding Tools for Instructional Problem Solving revised publication distributed by the Florida Department of Education. And there's a link that you can access this document in the references at the end of this module. General guidelines suggest that if more than 20% of your students are in the at-risk range based on your SEB screening, the goal would be to modify or change your universal SEB instruction. And the reason is that providing intensive or targeted intervention to a large percentage of your student population would quickly overwhelm school resources and personnel. So the most efficient way to address a large-scale, widespread problem would be to bolster or change your tier 1 intervention in some way to capture more students that would respond to this tier 1 instruction. If 5 to 20% of your students are in the at-risk range, and I say at-risk in terms of significant risk and some risk together. So if a screening tool parses out risk into some risk and high risk, combining both of those into an overall risk category. So if 5 to 20% of your student population is identified as at risk, then continuing universal SEB instruction and providing students with at-risk or targeted support who have been identified as being as at risk is the most appropriate course of action. If, and in the unlikely event, if less than 5% of your school population is identified as at risk, then it would be appropriate to focus on providing these students with individualized intervention. Because these students require individual focus that considers factors unique to this person's circumstances and skills, you don't want to do this with large percentages of your population because it would overwhelm your resources rather quickly. So the first question to ask at the universal level is this a large group or school-wide problem? And to do that, we would look at the percentages of students that fall in each risk category across the entire school. So if some risk and high risk, those percentages exceed 20%, the priority should be on focusing on tier 1 universal instruction in order to use your resources more efficiently. In this particular example, you can see that the some risk category and the high risk category exceed 20%. So in this particular example, it would be appropriate to focus on bolstering or improving tier 1 supports to capture more students who respond to the universal instruction before moving on to providing intervention for students who require more intensive levels of intervention. The next question to ask is it a small group or grade level problem? So we know that based on this particular example, tier 1 supports for the entire school is probably a good place to start. What we don't know is to what extent these problems or these levels of risk are concentrated in certain groups. So to look at this, we would compare the percentages of students at each risk level in each grade to the school-wide percentages that you see here. If we can do that, then we can provide resources within our school, such as social-emotional learning coaches or school psychologists that could be prioritized to the grade levels with the greatest discrepancies from the overall school levels. These data are fictitious, they're made up, but what it does provide is some examples of what it might look like in a particular school. So on the left, we have our school-wide data where we have 75% in the low risk range, 15% in some risk, and 10% in high risk. And then for each grade, we have similar values yielded by our screening tool. You can see in this example that many of the grade levels have similar percentages of students in the some risk and high risk categories. So these reflect levels that are similar to the overall school-wide data. However, with grade 3, you can see that we have many more students, a higher percentage of students in both the some risk category and the high risk level. So we appear to have students with more risk concentrated in 3rd grade. So given that we are going to use our resources efficiently, we should consider focusing them on the 3rd grade level or the small group level. A note of caution here is that we don't want to go so far as to drill down to individual classrooms in the effort to attribute those risk levels or those discrepancies to individual teachers. We are focused on providing students with the levels of support. So the focus should always be on how to help students in an efficient way without attributing them to particular teachers or classrooms or personnel involved. So there are many reasons that students might score in the some risk or high risk range. We are not looking to attribute those reasons to individual teachers or classrooms. Once we have identified whether or not this is a large group or a small group problem, we can then focus on how these data change over time. So in the previous slides, looking at the percentages of students in each risk category, those reflected one particular screening period. So for example, after the fall screening data are analyzed, we see that 15% fall in the some risk range and 10% fall in the high risk range. So this is a good starting point. However, over the course of the year, we want to know whether or not the students change. We want to know if students are moving across tiers or whether or not we are increasing the percentages of students who are having their needs met by universal or tier 1 support. So a model for evaluating the system effects comes from the academic literature by Shapiro and Clemens, which evaluates not only the percentages of students at risk, but also the movement across risk levels. So within this model, we start by comparing the percentages of students in each risk category across screening periods. So we look at our fall screening data and we see that we have 15% of the students in some risk, 10% in high risk, 25% at risk overall. Then we look at our screening, our spring screening data to see if that changes. Ideally, hopefully, we would see that number of students or that percentage of students decrease in the winter screening or the spring screening in comparison to fall. We want to see more students having their needs met by tier 1 instruction or more students having their needs met by tier 2 instruction to reduce the numbers of students who are receiving the highest, most intensive levels of intervention. So that's the first step. We compare percentages from each screening period for those students at risk. The next step is to determine how many students have improved. So we want to look to see the percentage or the number of students who have moved to a less intensive tier from one screening period to the next. So from fall to winter or from fall to spring, how many students moved from some risk to low risk? How many students moved from high risk to some risk or low risk? This gives us some indication that our supports that we have in place are effective. Finally, we need to look at the number of students who move to more intensive tiers. So looking to see students who were in the low risk category in the fall have moved to some risk or high risk in this winter or spring. Similarly, students who were in the some risk category moved to the high risk category. This is important because looking just at the percentage of students at risk in each screening period doesn't tell you whether or not those students are the same students. So just because the percentages of students at risk in fall and winter or fall and spring screening are the same, it does not necessarily mean that those are the same students. We could have movement. The goal, hopefully, is that we have more students moving from less intensive tiers, from more intensive tiers to less intensive tiers. We see improvement rather than seeing students move to more intensive needs for intervention. I'll give you an example of this model. We'll walk through some fake data, but basically the first step is to compare the percentages of students at risk across screening periods. So from fall to spring, for example. If there is no change in the overall percentage of students who are at risk, the goal should be to continue universal intervention. If the percentages of students at risk has decreased, that means more students are having their needs met by universal or tier 1 instruction. That is an indication that we should continue what we're doing, continue the universal intervention. If the percentages of students at risk has increased, that means that we have students moving from less intensive levels of intervention to more intensive levels of intervention or risk. So if we see more students moving to higher levels of risk, that's an indication that we need to modify or change our universal intervention, particularly if the percentage of students at risk overall exceeds 20%. Once we've identified the percentage of students at risk and compared them across screening periods, the next step would be to identify the number of students that move to a less intensive risk category across screening periods. So from fall to spring, we have students moving from some risk to low risk or from high risk to some risk and low risk. After we've done that, the next step is to identify the number of students that move to a more intensive risk category from one screening period to the next. So if a greater number of students move from less intensive tiers to more intensive tiers, continue the intervention. If a greater number of students move to more intensive tiers than to less intensive tiers, we need to change or modify the intervention. So if we have students moving from low risk to some risk and high risk, if that percentage exceeds the students moving in the opposite direction, then we really need to think about how we need to change or modify our intervention. If we have students moving from some risk and high risk down to low risk, and that percentage exceeds students moving in the opposite direction, then we can continue our tier 1 intervention because it appears to be working. In this example, these data indicate the percentages that moved from more intensive tiers to less intensive tiers. So on the left in the gray bars, we have the percentages of students who moved from low risk to moderate risk from fall to spring, and then from moderate risk to high risk in fall to spring. So these are students who do not appear to have their needs met by existing intervention. Their risk is increasing over time. We compare these values to those students moving in the opposite direction. So those students who have moved from moderate risk to low risk and from high risk to moderate risk. So these students are requiring, their level of risk has decreased over time from one screening period to the next. If the percentages of students in this area on the right, those moving to less intensive intervention, moving to less intensive levels of risk exceeds those who are moving in the opposite direction towards more intensive levels of risk, that gives us indication that our intervention is more effective. And specifically, if we look at the students moving from moderate risk to low risk and compare that to students moving from low risk to moderate risk in the opposite direction, if the percentage is indicating less risk over time, that can give us some indication that our targeted tier 2 intervention was effective. If those students who have moderate risk are connected with tier 2 intervention, and that percentage of students who need tier 2 intervention decreases from one screening period to the next, that indicates that what we're doing is at least somewhat effective. So once we've identified how to use screening data at the universal level to inform our universal supports, we can move on to using data at the targeted level. And by targeted level, I mean intervention that is provided to smaller groups of students who have needs that exceed what can be met by just universal supports. So again, we want to focus our efforts on increasing the percentages of students that we can capture with universal tier 1 supports, but there are always going to be students who do not respond entirely to those tier 1 supports. They require more targeted intervention. So starting with focusing on what can be done at the school or grade level to provide intervention to all students to increase the percentages of students who are responding, and then moving towards using data for smaller groups of students. And that I will cover in this section with some specific examples of using fictitious data. So using screening data to help students at the targeted level can really be conceptualized in a way similar to that used in academic literature. So in the academic literature, there's a model of response to intervention known as the standard treatment protocol. In SEB screening, we can use something somewhat similar in which we identify students who need more intensive or targeted support and connect them with existing supports. So in order to do this, we start by creating a resource map of existing supports, which I'll show you in the next slide. But the point is to identify what we already have available to us to help students who need a little bit more than just the universal or tier 1 supports. Then we can identify the entry criteria necessary for students to access these targeted supports. We can identify the outcome measures necessary to monitor their progress. We can identify the criteria necessary for these students to exit this targeted intervention. And also, we should pay attention to considering additional needs. And I will cover these in subsequent slides. But this model is adapted from Kathy Lane and colleagues, as well as a presentation by Tim Lewis and colleagues. And both of these resources are available to you. And in the last slide, there are links provided. But we'll cover them in the next examples, in the next slides. This slide shows you an example of a resource map in which we have a school who sat down as a team and cataloged all of the interventions they have available to support students who might have more significant social, emotional, or behavioral needs. These are just some examples that schools typically use, something like a daily behavior report card, a self-management intervention, check-in, check-out, social skills training in a small group setting, or cognitive behavioral therapy. So for each intervention, it's important to consider what skills are being targeted by this intervention. For example, a daily report card might target engagement, conduct, or social skills. If the team can clearly articulate what skills are targeted by each intervention, then it makes it much easier to connect students based on skill deficits in their screening results to interventions that target those particular skills. This resource map also identifies the format, whether it's individual or small group, as well as the location, the expected duration, and who is responsible for providing that intervention. Now, just because a classroom teacher implements the intervention, they will still need some support around conceptualizing, creating, and implementing the intervention. So usually a school psychologist or support personnel will help them with that. But the goal with this first step in this targeted intervention model is to just outline what resources are available to bring to bear for those students who might need a little bit extra additional support. Once we've identified what the interventions are that we can implement for these particular students. The next step is to identify how we select students to receive each intervention. So what are the entry criteria necessary for a student to receive daily behavior report card intervention or check-in, check-out, for example? By doing this, we can facilitate the process of taking our screening data and linking it to intervention. If we can say, for example, that a student who scores in the at-risk range above a T-score of 60 on the cognitive attention scale of a particular screening tool, and make that an entry criterion for receiving something like a self-management intervention, that facilitates the process because it streamlines us looking at the data and identifying those students and saying these students would be a good fit for this particular intervention. So in the entry criteria, we should use our SEB screening data, but school teams may also wish to include additional data as criteria, particularly if your intervention resources are limited. So if you can imagine that you have 20% of your students who are, let's say 15% of your students who fall in the some risk range who might receive targeted support. You may not have the resources to provide targeted tier 2 intervention to everyone. So the question is, how can you prioritize students based on SEB screening data, but also other sources of information? And those typically would be things like office discipline referrals, attendance data, academic scores or academic screening data, as well as curriculum-based measures, things like DIBELS or AIMSweb. So if the team can clearly articulate what these entry criteria are necessary for a student to access the tier 2 supports, it makes turning the screening data into intervention a much more efficient process. This is just an example of some outlined entry criteria for a particular screening tool. In this case, in this example, the Behavior Intervention Monitoring Assessment System, or the BIMAS. The BIMAS has 5 scales, 3 of which are problem scales: conduct, negative affect, and cognitive attention, and 2 which are adaptive skills, social and academic. So for example, if we want to connect students to tier 2 intervention, we may say that a student with a T-score above 60 on the conduct scale, which would place them in the some risk range, might match best with a daily report card intervention, intervention 1. There also may be some benefit for the student to receiving check-in, check-out. So one of these 2 interventions is probably the most appropriate for the student based on what we have available to provide these students. In addition, we may also wish to consider additional criteria, such as more than 2 office discipline referrals by the time the fall screening is conducted. So by outlining this, it gives us a way to link our data to intervention in a much more efficient way. You can see that based on the particular skill area or problem area identified by the screening, it links to different interventions. So the skills targeted by the interventions that you've outlined in the resource map can help you match the students to each particular screening area. This facilitates the process in a much more efficient way. Once we have identified what the interventions are, we've mapped out what we have available to us, we've identified what the entry criteria are necessary for the students to receive each particular intervention and how they would best match with each intervention that we have available to us. The next question is to identify what are the outcome measures? How will we know that a student is making progress? Because social, emotional, and behavioral screening tends to happen only 2 to 3 times a year, it's not frequent enough to really measure progress in the short term. So we need additional measures in addition to the screening data to help us make decisions in real time as to whether or not an intervention is working. So examples of these additional outcome measures may include things like performance criteria that are embedded within each intervention. So for example, in a daily behavior report card or a check-in, check-out intervention, there are daily ratings that occur. And these rating data can be used and graphed over time to see whether or not a student is making progress in the short term. There may also be additional progress monitoring measures related to behavior that are efficient and can be used, things such as direct behavior rating scales that can be used for each student to give you a constant stream of data that indicate whether or not the student's behavior is changing over time. And then finally, additional permanent products such as completed homework, projects that a student does, work samples. These types of outcomes can give you a sense as to whether or not behavior is indirectly impacting social, emotional, and behavioral functioning. So again, the goal is to articulate all of these outcome measures ahead of time as part of your plan, so that when a student begins receiving targeted Tier 2 intervention, you can put these measures in place and measure whether or not a student is making progress in the short term. In addition to those progress monitoring measures, the team also needs to articulate what the exit criteria are. So if we are matching students who are at risk to targeted Tier 2 interventions, we need to know when is it appropriate for that student to stop receiving this targeted Tier 2 intervention. And the reason is that we want to use our resources in an efficient way. So over time, there will be students who might need targeted support, and there will be students who no longer need targeted support. Remember that in a multi-tiered system of support, the provision of intervention is flexible. So based on student response, we can discontinue an intervention and put it back in place when the student might need it again. We can also put the intervention in place as students need it for as long as they need it. So the exit criteria help us determine whether or not a student has made enough progress that they no longer need this particular Tier 2 intervention. So these exit criteria should include SEB screening data. So from fall to winter, for example, how did the student change on the SEB screening? But you will also consider the progress monitoring measures, or the outcome measures that you've articulated in the previous step. So using all of these data together, you can gather a more appropriate picture of whether or not the student has made enough progress that he, she, or they no longer needs this particular intervention. Finally, in this targeted intervention model, students may have needs that cannot be addressed through school-based intervention. So although we have a number of supports that we can bring to bear, we may not be able to meet all of the needs of a particular student. So it's important to identify other areas and articulate action steps that can be implemented to help support these students and these needs outside of school. For example, we may connect the student's family with outside agencies to meet basic needs, such as food, shelter, or unemployment benefits, to help the family with the basic needs that may impact the student's particular social, emotional, and behavioral functioning. We can also coordinate with medical providers outside of school to coordinate care, thinking about wraparound services, or coordinating in a way that we are working on the same general goals, but just in different ways. School may receive therapy outside of school or counseling outside of school, but if we can implement behavioral supports, social emotional supports that align with those goals, but work on them in a different way to facilitate generalization, then we're going to have a much greater impact than each of us working separately on separate goals. Okay, so the previous slides we talked about using a standard targeted intervention protocol. So in that model, we articulated what interventions we have available to us, what a student needs in terms of entry criteria to receive that intervention, how we're going to measure that student's progress, and how we'll know that the student has made enough progress to no longer need that intervention. I would argue that that's probably the most efficient way to provide targeted Tier 2 intervention. However, an alternative model, which many schools use, is a problem-solving model. And you're probably familiar with this on an individual student level, if you've been part of a student support team or an intervention team looking at individual student progress, particularly with academics, you've applied a problem-solving model. But it can also be used on a group level to examine what's happening, as well as the best course of action and how to evaluate that intervention or course of action. So in the following slides, I'll give you an overview of a problem-solving model and how it applies to social emotional screening data on a group level. In the problem-solving model, there are 4 basic steps. In some models, you'll see it expanded to 6 or 7 steps. This particular model that I'm going to show you, the team-initiated problem-solving model, or TIPS, has 6 main steps in the problem-solving model. But generally, the first step is to identify a problem. We have to know what we are targeting. What is the problem first before we can set goals and provide intervention? Once we've identified the problem, we can set goals that are reasonable and realistic for a student to make progress. We can implement an intervention, monitor that intervention and the extent to which a student is making progress, and then make decisions about whether or not that intervention was effective, and use those data to either continue the intervention, modify it in some way, or discontinue the intervention. This is a graphic of the team-initiated problem-solving model, or TIPS 2, by Horner and colleagues. In the references section in the final slide of this module, I have provided you with a link to more information about the TIPS model, but you can see a couple key characteristics of this model. One is that it incorporates aspects of the problem-solving model, such as identifying the problem with precision, identifying goals, setting solutions or implementing interventions, implementing them with integrity, monitoring the impact, monitoring student progress, and then making a summative evaluative decision. One key aspect of this problem-solving model is that data are used at every stage of the model. So in identifying a problem with precision, we use data to identify the area that a student needs support. We also use data to identify goals and set realistic and reasonable expectations for student progress. I'll give you an example of this in a little more detail in the following slides. In the first step of the problem-solving model, we have to quantify the problem. We have to identify a discrepancy between a current level of performance among our students and an expected or desired level of performance. In most instances with social emotional screening data, an expected or desired level is based on the cutoffs for risk. So we may expect that we have 75 to 80% of our students whose needs are met in a way by universal supports. So they'll be at the low risk range. We may expect that 10 to 15% fall in the some risk range, and that 5%, about 5% to 10% fall in the high risk range. So using our school level data to identify expected or desired levels and the risk cutoffs can help us quantify the discrepancy between how our students are actually doing and the way that we would expect them to function in terms of social, emotional, and behavioral functioning. After we have identified this discrepancy, we develop a problem statement that includes the who, the what, the when, the where, and to the extent possible, the why for every problem that the team determines warrants a solution. As part of this problem identification stage, we're also prioritizing problems. So when we develop problem statements, we'll start with what we believe to be the most significant problem, that which needs the most imminent or immediate attention. In these problem statements, we'll also be able to include additional sources of information if necessary to help us identify the problem and come up with a problem statement. In this particular example, in this slide, you can see that there are screening data for a fall screening using the BIMAS, which we used before. So we have 3 problem scales: conduct, negative affect, and cognitive attention And then we have 2 adaptive scales, social and academic. For each scale, we have an expected level at which we expect a certain percentage of students to fall in each risk category or risk range. So based on our school-wide data or cutoffs for risk, historically, we would expect that 75% of our students would fall in the low risk range. About 18% would fall in the some risk range, and 7% would fall in the high risk range. Now, these values for expected levels are dependent on local data. So for example, in this example, these values are based on historically what we would expect students to fall. We would historically expect that most of our students, 75%, would fall in the low risk range. So comparing what we would expect based on what we usually see in our school district, we can see that the conduct scale, we have about the same number of students who fall in the low risk range. We have a little bit less than we would expect students falling in the some risk range, but that is because we have more students than we would expect in the high risk range. So we do have a discrepancy on the conduct scale between what we would expect in terms of the number or the percentage of students we expect in the high risk range versus what we actually see. So this is a problem, what we expect or the desired state and what we currently have. So there's a discrepancy. There's a higher percentage of students in the high risk range on the conduct scale for the fall by mass screening. I made this example simple to highlight this, but you can see then if you go look at the other scales that although they're not perfect matches, we have generally or roughly the same percentages of students that fall in each risk category as we would expect based on our historical data. So if we are looking at identifying problems in this particular school, the problem lies with student conduct, at least as indicated by this particular screening tool. After we've identified that discrepancy, the next step is to develop a problem statement. So here's an example of a problem statement based on those data. A higher percentage of 8th grade students than expected scored in the high risk range on the conduct scale of the fall 2020 by Mass 2 screening, which is hypothesized to result from low implementation fidelity of existing targeted tier 2 intervention. So a couple things to note. We have specific data that indicate a discrepancy. So the what is the conduct scale, the who are the 8th grade students, the why is hypothesized to be low implementation fidelity. And I say hypothesized because at this stage, that's what we think it is. But through intervention, we can determine whether or not this problem statement is accurate. And we'll talk about that in a minute. You also notice that we have a when. So on the fall 2020 by Mass 2 screening. So it's very specific in identifying the discrepancy between current state and desired state, as well as when this problem is occurring, where or with whom 8th grade students, and a hypothesized reason as to why it's happening. So once we have this problem statement, now we can set a realistic goal for these students. We know who to target, 8th grade students. We know what to target, conduct, and we have a sense of how much we want to see improvement. We have hard percentages here of what we currently have and what we want to see or what's expected. The next step is to set goals. If any of you have worked in education, I'm sure you're familiar with SMART goals. So specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timed. I'm not going to go through all of these in too much detail, but specific goals are specific in that they target skills, specific skills that we want to see a student improve or behaviors that we want to see change. Measurable means that we have some way to measure them. Based on our SEB screening data, we are able to come up with a percentage that we would expect to see, so we can measure it in some way. Achievable means that they're realistic. So if we have 15% of our students who are in the high risk range, it's probably not realistic or achievable to set a goal that we want that down to 0. It's just not going to happen. So how can we set a realistic goal? Can we get closer to the 7% that we would expect? That would be a more achievable goal. Relevant means that this behavior or these skills that we're targeting will have an impact on student functioning in some way. So if we target student conduct, will that also have an impact on how the students learn, how the students get along with each other, the attendance, the time they spend on learning? All of these things are relevant. So the extent to which our goal focused on conduct is relevant to students' education and the goals we have for them in the broader educational sense. And then timed. By when do we want to see this change happen? With SEB screening, given that you administer screening typically 2 to 3 times a year, your time frame for these goals is going to be typically from one screening period to the next, or over the course of the whole year, from fall to spring screening. As an example, based on the data that I showed you previously, an appropriate goal for students in this particular example would be the following. On the winter 2021 BIMAS screening, 7% or less of 8th grade students will score in the high risk range, and 20% or less will score in the some risk range on the conduct scale. So I have a specific behavior, a specific set of behaviors or constructs that I'm focusing on, the conduct. I have a measurable criterion that I've put in place. 7% or less of my population of 8th grade students will score in the high risk range. I have an achievable standard. I'm going from 15% to 7%. I think that our team believes that that is a realistic expectation based on historical school progress. I have a relevant behavior in that conduct is believed to have an impact on academic functioning and larger student social functioning within the school. And then I have my time frame on the winter 2021 BIMAS screening. So I have a SMART goal here. Related to what we've talked about before, it's important to understand what's happening that will lead to this goal. If I achieve this goal, what it means is that 8% of the students who are in the high risk range on the fall screening, 8% of all of my students who fell in the high risk range in the fall screening will move to a lower risk category. So they may move to some risk or low risk. So we have movement over time for students who have less risk. And my goal that I've set in this problem solving model captures that phenomenon. Once I've set my goal, I know what I'm targeting, I know what I want to see happen, then we can plan an intervention. One option is to implement or modify an existing intervention. So if we have a framework set up in our school for check-in, check-out, for example, it's used as the primary targeted intervention for students, we can examine this intervention to see the extent to which it has been implemented as intended. So if our check-in, check-out has been implemented with low fidelity, the first step would be, let's just increase the fidelity. Let's make sure that we're implementing this intervention as it's intended and that we're being consistent in how we support students. If we do that, then we might see the desired change that we would hope for in our goal statement. Another option would be to develop a new intervention to meet student needs that's not met by existing supports or intervention. Of course, there are drawbacks to this, particularly that it requires more resources and time that may not be available to us. So when planning an intervention, it's always important to consider the extent to which existing interventions or supports have been implemented with fidelity. If they have not been implemented with fidelity, the first step in intervention planning should really be to boost that fidelity. Increase the consistency with which that intervention is implemented, and then you might see the goals that's desired in the goal statement. If you have this intervention in place and fidelity has been high, then you may consider, well, maybe we need to do something different. We need to approach this problem in a different way, in which case you might develop a new intervention plan for students in this some risk group. The next step, of course, is to implement the intervention. Generally, you want to have this intervention implemented for long enough to see impact. Most Tier 2 interventions will say somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks. However, it's important to understand that not all students will respond immediately. And even though that you've implemented this intervention for 6 to 8 weeks, it's possible that at the beginning phases, you didn't implement it with as much fidelity. So implementing this intervention, and we say for 6 to 8 weeks, we mean 6 to 8 weeks of solid, high fidelity implementation. In this process of implementing the intervention, you also have to identify how you are measuring intervention integrity. One way is to look at permanent products. So if we're using a check-in, check-out intervention, as in this example, one way to evaluate fidelity would be to look at the permanent products, the record forms that the interventionists are actually generating for these students. Another way would be for interventionists to keep a log of some way, or a intervention checklist to document the extent to which they provided this intervention. So check-in, check-out coordinator, for example, could keep a weekly log of meetings with students and record whether or not the core features of the intervention were in place. The goal is to establish that the intervention was implemented with integrity so that when you evaluate it at the next phase, or 2 phases from now, that you are able to say with certainty that it was the intervention that had an impact or not, and not the extent to which it was implemented or failed to be implemented. After you have implemented the intervention, as part of this process, you are going to monitor student progress. So this graph is just an example of the check-in, check-out points earned by all students in this targeted Tier 2 intervention group. So over time, we would want to see the weekly percentage of check-in, check-out points exceed 80%. So students are meeting essentially 80% of their goals by the end of this intervention. So we can see that when this intervention started, this check-in, check-out started, the percentages of points that students earned were relatively low. But over time, after implementing this intervention, we can see that students have made progress based on this measure that shows progress in the shorter term. So we have progress, which we can then verify with subsequent screening. So from fall to winter, did the student make progress based on the social emotional screening data, but also these more frequent progress monitoring measures, in this case, check-in, check-out points. We also have to monitor the implementation fidelity, as we discussed. We want that to be generally above 80%. If it's not above 80%, then we need to consider how we can boost that, and we may need to implement this intervention for a little bit longer so that we have consistent implementation that actually has the opportunity to impact student functioning. Finally, we evaluate the intervention. So in this step of the problem-solving model, we review the fidelity data to determine whether or not the intervention was implemented as intended. If it was, we have high fidelity, then we can move on to looking at the outcome data because we know that the intervention was implemented as intended. If the fidelity data indicate that fidelity was low, then we need to talk about why that is. What are some barriers that led to low fidelity of implementation? And address those barriers, and we may need to implement this intervention for a longer period of time with high fidelity to really determine and evaluate whether or not it works. So if we have high fidelity of implementation, we can move on to reviewing outcome data and evaluate whether or not the students met the goal. So one way is to look at the progress monitoring data in the previous slide, but as an outcome that aligns more with our goal statement, we look at the winter or spring screening data. So was the goal achieved? So in our spring screening, we have 5% of 8th grade students scored in the high risk range and 20% scored in the some risk range on the conduct scale. So in this sense, we have achieved our goal. Thus, we will continue the targeted intervention. It may be that some students no longer need targeted intervention. So those students who have moved out of the some risk range, they may no longer need the targeted intervention. And so we can exit them out of it and implement it for students who may need this support. If the outcome data indicate that the goal was not achieved, then we repeat this problem-solving process. We need to modify the intervention in some way. It's possible that we need to set a more realistic and less ambitious goal. It's also possible that we need to change the way that we provide intervention to help us achieve the goal that we set for ourselves. So we repeat the problem-solving process. The idea is that it's cyclical, that we revisit these interventions and we repeat the process using the data that we've collected in an ongoing way. Okay, so I've talked about using social emotional screening data to inform targeted intervention using both a standard intervention approach or a targeted intervention model and a problem-solving model. Next, I think it's important to talk about the third level of intervention, or intensive intervention. Now, there are a couple features of intensive intervention that make it somewhat beyond the scope of this particular module. One is that intensive intervention is highly individually focused. So if you have a large percentage of your students who are falling in the high risk range or indicated by screening data to need intensive intervention, then it may overwhelm your resources quickly. So when we talk about intensive intervention, we really mean individualized intervention. And there's some important characteristics outlined by Sugai and Horner that relate to intensive intervention. First, it's function-based. So when we consider the problems that students are exhibiting, we need to consider contextual data, contextual factors that may be contributing to the problem. These will be unique for every individual student, but we need to collect data in order to define exactly what the problems are for an individual student and then place them in the context of the environment. What are some environmental factors that are contributing to this problem or maintaining this problem? Looking at things like antecedents and the consequences that follow these behaviors, as well as the appropriateness of particular behaviors within cultural contexts. Intensive intervention also focuses on outcomes and objectives that are priorities for the implementers. So if you consider intensive intervention for students with social, emotional, or behavioral needs, there may be different priorities based on different students. So a teacher for one student may have a priority to focus on reducing conduct problems, where another may have a priority on reducing internalizing symptomatology or negative affect. And so this is how it becomes individualized and intensive, is that these outcomes and objectives for each student are determined by the team based on members of the team and what they view the priority to be, including the student's parents. Another key feature of these intensive interventions is that they are evidence-based. So we have a base of literature that shows that these interventions are likely to be effective, especially effective for the types of problems that we've identified for this particular student. These interventions should also include wraparound supports, as we discussed before. So communicating and coordinating with community supports and outside mental health providers can help increase the likelihood that this intervention will be effective. We're much more likely to see improvement with a multifaceted intervention across contexts than one that's just implemented for problems that we see in school. And finally, intensive intervention has consideration of the systems to support the capacity of school personnel to implement these interventions. So an intervention can be perfectly designed in terms of what is likely to work, and matches the hypothesized functions of what are maintaining the problems. However, if the school or the particular implementers don't have the capacity to implement this as intended, then it's not likely to work. So a good intensive intervention also considers the capacity that the implementers have to be able to carry out this intervention. And if they don't have the capacity and they require more training, how will that training be provided and who will provide it? All of these are key features to consider in intensive intervention. You can see that I did not provide an example based on social emotional screening data for intensive intervention, mainly because it requires consideration of much more information beyond just what's provided by social emotional screening. So the social emotional screening data may serve as the starting point to identify these students, but for students who require intensive intervention, you will collect much more data, possibly through a functional behavior assessment or a psychoeducational evaluation to identify the problem and place the problem in context. So SEB screening data serves as a starting point for intensive intervention, but it is by no means everything you need to be able to implement an effective intensive intervention. The key is that students at this level of intervention continue to receive the universal supports that are provided to every student in the school. And they may have tried targeted or slightly more intensive supports and found those supports to be ineffective. That concludes the presentation and this module on using social emotional behavioral screening data. However, I do want to point out several references which may be helpful to you that I've cited in this presentation. They are listed here. You can click on these links or copy these URL to go to these resources and find more information. The Florida Department of Education has provided a document on guiding tools for instructional problem solving. Horner and colleagues have published a guide for team-initiated problem solving. Kathy Lane and colleagues have published an article which I used as the framework for discussing more standardized targeted intervention protocol, as well as Tim Lewis and colleagues provided a presentation around using school-wide SEB data, and they provide some additional examples. So this might be a good resource for you to look for additional concrete examples of what this looks like in the real world. And Shapiro and Clemens, of course, have provided a conceptual model for evaluating changes in screening data over time, looking at the percentage of students that move from one level of intensity to the next. And that article is cited there. So I thank you for your time. If you have any questions related to this particular module, I welcome you to contact me at brian.daniels@umb.edu. I'm happy to answer any questions about social emotional screening in general, or how to use social emotional screening data. I would also like to refer you to the Birch project website at www.umb.edu/birch. And the email address here is the general email for the Birch project. Catherine Doherty Kurtz, who is the project director, will be the one likely responding to your email. So please feel free to contact either me or the Birch project for more information about the presentation today, as well as more information about social emotional and behavioral screening in general. So thank you very much. I look forward to hearing from you.